Each bottle of whisky contains clues as to what might be inside it. Legal requirements. There are 5 things to look for. The maker's name, whether there's an age statement or not, the alcoholic strength, the legal definition, and any other indication as to what style the whisky may be. Let's have a look at each bottle in turn. Here I have a bottle of bourbon. I can tell this is bourbon. It says Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. Straight bourbon is a legal definition. Straight whiskey in America means that it is a minimum 51% of the main ingredients. So straight bourbon whiskey is minimum 51% corn. If this said straight rye whiskey, it would be minimum 51% rye. If it said straight wheat whiskey, minimum 51% wheat. The other definition as far as straight whiskey goes is that it must be aged in brand new, heavily charred oak casks. One little word, but it means a huge amount. The other thing to look for is the alcoholic strength. 45% alcohol by volume, or in American proof, 90 proof. American proof is basically double the percentage volume. Americans like to do things bigger. And obviously the brand name. In this case, Buffalo Trace. There is no age statement on this. It's not compulsory to have an age statement. An age doesn't necessarily mean quality. It's simply an indicator of what might be in the bottle. As far as this bottle of bourbon goes, here we have another straight bourbon, but here's an indication of what style this bourbon may be. For around the top here it says single barrel, which means it has come from a single barrel. In fact, the label is full of information about what this barrel was. This was dumped. The barrel was emptied, in other words, on the 20th of April 2009 from barrel number 300, stored in warehouse H on rick number 28. It is 46.5% alcohol by volume. This is also a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, so we know the legal definition of why it has got that appellation. And obviously, it's got the maker's name, in this case, Blanton's, with the racehorse on top. Single barrel. Next bottle is coming from Ireland, so you've got the E in the label. This is 43% alcohol by volume, and it is 12 years old. Now, under all whisky definitions, if there's an age statement on the label, this refers to the youngest element within the blend of whiskies within the bottle. There may be whiskies older than 12 in here, but if you're going to put an age statement on it, it refers to the youngest component part. So the youngest whiskey in this bottle of Jameson Special Reserve is 12 years old. It's Irish whiskey. And then underneath here, we've got a little bit of indication as to what style of whiskey it is. It says pot still character. That's Irish pot still, that mix of malted and unmalted barley which is being used. And obviously the brand name, in this case, Jameson. We'll move on to Scotch whisky here. Different definitions of Scotch whisky. Here we have a bottle which says blended Scotch whisky in gold writing down there. There is your legal definition. Blended Scotch whisky means this is a mix of single malt whiskies and grain whiskies brought together. There's no age statement on it, but again, there doesn't have to be. And the alcoholic strength on the back here, 43% by volume. And the brand name, the famous Grouse. No other indication as to what style of whisky it is. It says a marriage of finest Scotch whiskies matured in seasoned oak casks, but that's a definition of Scotch whisky. Our next two whiskies are also Scotch whiskies, but these are single malt. Let's have a look at this one. The Macallan, single malt. Highland single malt Scotch whisky. There's lots of clues in here. Single malt means that this is coming from one specific distillery, i.e. the Macallan. So if there's a name of a distillery and it says single malt, it has to come 100% from that one distillery. Single, individual, unique, from that one place. It also says Highland. There are various regions within Scotland. Macallan is from Speyside, but Speyside whiskies can also call themselves Highland whiskies. You might see whiskies with Lowland written on them. They come from the southern part of the country. Highland whiskies from above Glasgow right up to the far north. Islay whiskies, I-S-L-A-Y, whiskies from the island of Islay, 100 miles due west of Glasgow. They're the ones that tend to be a bit smoky. Again, we have the bottling strength. Remember, Scotch whisky has to be above 40% ABV. This is at 43. We have the age statement. Remember, Scotch whisky must be 3 years old or above. This is 12 years old. In other words, the youngest whisky that's gone into this bottle is 12 years. And the other thing indicating style is down here. Exclusively matured in selected sherry oak casks from Jerez, Spain. That gives an indication as to what the flavour may be. Sherry oak casks tend to give you rich fruitcake-like aromas. And then looking at the colour, you can see this is going to be quite a big, rich whisky. Lots of clues on here. This bottle here of a Knock is a Highland single malt. So again, it says exactly the same as on Macallan. The only difference, or the only couple of differences here, is it's slightly stronger. It's 46% ABV. It is 16 years old. Youngest whisky in here, therefore, has been aged for 16 years in cask. Again, it is a single malt whisky. In other words, it's coming from this one individual distillery. The thing I want to draw your attention to on this label is this, unchill filtered. Most whiskies, before they're put in bottle, are put through a process called chill filtration. Chill filtration basically stabilises the whiskies. It pulls out fatty acids within the whisky, which might cause the whisky to go cloudy if you add ice or you add water, or the temperature in which it's stored drops too low. And people end up with a glass of cloudy whisky. Many consumers don't like this. So the vast majority of Scotch whiskies, blends especially, and most single malts will be chill filtered. However, chill filtering can strip out some of the mouthfeel and maybe some of the taste of a whisky. So increasingly these days, you're seeing whiskies which are unchill filtered. In other words, they haven't gone through this process. They may throw a slight haze. And I think you can see on this bottle, there's a slight haze on this bottle. There's nothing wrong with this liquid. In fact, it's got perhaps more flavour than you would expect. So don't be scared if your whisky goes cloudy. It's unchill filtered. It's an important phrase to remember because it's an important phrase to understand on a bottle, an important phrase to help educate people as to why this whisky may go cloudy in your glass. And of course, the other thing about these two is they're single malt whiskies. And when you see malt on the label, it means it's made from malted barley exclusively. And our final whisky category, our final whisky style, is a very small one, but it's a small one which is growing. And the indication is up here. It is single grain whisky. This is a South African bottling. This is Bain's Cape Mountain whisky, bottled at 43%. I don't think Cape Mountain is a definition as yet, but it could well become a legal definition. But there's the brand name. The important thing here is this, single grain whisky. So rather than being a malt whisky, which we've seen with the Macallan and the Annock, made from malted barley, this is made from grain. This is made from corn. This will give you a different style of whisky. It'll be softer and sweeter and more gentle. Scotch whisky is governed by a set of regulations enshrined in the Scotch Whisky Act, which is part of UK law, recognised in EU law, and also by the WTO. It's there to ensure that all distillers are conforming to the same set of rules. Let's have a quick look at what they cover. First of all, it has to be made from cereal, specifically from water and malted barley. The water and malted barley will be covering things such as single malt whisky. But it also states that other cereals may be added to this. What other cereals, you may ask? Well, that will be wheat or maize, corn. And that is for covering the production of grain whisky. These cereals must be processed into a mash at the distillery in Scotland, obviously. And only endogenous enzyme systems can be used. In other words, you can't add enzymes to convert that starch into sugar. It has to be within the cereals themselves, which is the malted barley. It then must be distilled at that distillery to a strength of no more than 94.8% alcohol by volume. That might seem very strong for single malt whisky, and it is. That comes off the still at about 72%. But remember, grain whisky. Grain whisky is distilled in column stills to a much higher strength. Why 94.8? Well, that's another part of the regulations. The spirit must derive its flavour from its base ingredients. In other words, it can't be neutral. It has to have flavour. So flavour is actually being built in to all of this process. The other part of the regulations concerns maturation. The spirit, new make spirit, or plain British spirit as it's legally known, must be aged in warehouses in Scotland for a minimum of 3 years before it can even be called whisky. It has to be matured in oak casks. The oak type isn't specified, but the wood type is. It must be oak. And the size must be under 700 litres. These days, 3 different sizes of barrels are used. American barrels, which are 200 litres, hogsheads, which are 250 litres, and sherry butts or puncheons, which will be 500 litres. Occasionally, you will find a slightly larger cask, which is called a gorda or a fat boy, and that is 700 litres. The reason for this maximum size of cask is to stop unscrupulous distillers, which of course do not exist in Scotland, simply pouring all their new make whisky into a vat the size of a room, which is made of oak. You won't get any interaction between wood and spirit. It'll just be a neutral holding vessel. So by restricting the size to 700 litres, you are actually building in flavour compounds. The whisky then can be bottled at no less than 40% alcohol by volume, and in a recent change to regulations, all single malt whisky has to be bottled in Scotland. The only addition which is permitted is a use of spirit caramel. This isn't to sweeten up. In fact, spirit caramel is bitter. Adding too much would make the whisky bitter. But adding spirit caramel will be used to standardise colour, so that consumers aren't confused if one batch is very light and the next batch is dark, or so on. Very, very tiny amounts of spirit caramel will be used to tint the colour up. It does not affect flavour.